How do you determine the light source when you're setting up your non-metal? So the biggest thing for me is just the model itself, right? So we went with this model, basically the light source kind of right here, right? So we've got the brighter section of skin here, and that guides me. You know, you'll notice that as we go from this section here on the body, we lose a lot of our value as we go down, you know. So I get more shadow and stuff down low, and all of it's kind of angled at the same angle of his spine here. Right? Sometimes I'll do that. I'll take cues on the model and pick an angled light source, but most times I just look at it. And a lot of times right shoulder makes a lot of sense. I don't know if it's because a lot of sculptors are right-handed, and so when they're sculpting, even when they're sculpting digitally or by hand, if they're working here, then a lot of your detail tends to build from left to right as a sculptor. And because a lot of the detail is on the left, what is the model's left side, our right, then a lot of times it gives you a really good position to put lighting coming this way because you'll get a lot of contrast on it. But you can choose anything. I could have chosen to spotlight him on all these sores and had all this and be in darkness. But basically it's that. From the beginning when I prime a model, you know, so like we recently did the pre-highlight on our kangaroo for our tank girl diorama. We're just going to be using the torso is why the bottom of him isn't painted. But you can see the same thing here. Here I decided to light him on his left cheek. So I've got my pre-highlight set up to give me my shadows and start my kind of, you know, paint by numbers kit on this model, so to speak. So I know as I'm layering up and airbrushing and whatever I'm going to do on this model, where to keep my highlights and my brighter transitions. So when you have something like this, then when you apply it to any metallics, you've got that source already, right? So I don't have to re-choose. I just look at it from here and say, okay, that's why, like with light here, that's why this back section of this shoulder plate would be brighter, where I've got it bright here, and then fall off into darkness across the front face, right? Now I'm taking some liberties with this area down here because in a perfect sense, if our light source is here, right, this is all in shadow. But I'm not putting him in like spotlight where it's completely dark on this side. You can imagine the reflection, the ground reflection if you're outside provides a lot of a light source too. You know, we talk about that a lot with regards to how light interacts with the environment. So let's take a moment and discuss this. So let's say you have, you know, a model, and that model sits, you know, it's got its base, and then we've got dude, right? So we've got this is going to be shield and sword dude right here, right? We've got dude holding. Right, so we got shield and sword bro. Okay, so we've got our model, and no matter where you pick your light source to come from on this guy, so let's say we pick, you know, a light source that comes from this direction. That's our main light source, right? So if we just write main, right, he's outside, and it's if we were to do this as north, south, east, and west, then this is like, you know, early kind of 9:30 in the morning, right? 10 o'clock in the morning kind of timeline. So the sun's coming this way. So we would have, you know, brighter, the normal shading on the model would start dropping over here, right? The back side of this shield would be very dark, right? Big flat plane with the light away from it, which means that, you know, the hand in here and the arm and everything would be darker too until it gets out beyond the shield, and I'd have some highlight on that shoulder and a little bit on that chest, and then it would get darker underneath his pecs, and then of course on this side of his body over here as we fall into the underarm and such, we'd have a lot more shadow, a little bit over here from the head across this shoulder, right? This would be like this, and then of course we'd be darker on the back side of this hand over here, and then this side of the sword would be very dark on the bottom side of the bevel, and then kind of shaded to bright edge, blah blah blah, right? So we basically would just continue working in this manner across the whole model. But what we have to remember is that the ground is a light source too, because this light doesn't just hit the model. This light comes from this same angle, right, everywhere, and hits the ground all around our model, okay? And as it does so, it reflects off of the ground. And if you're familiar with, how rays of light interact, or rays of anything, right, they bounce off a surface, and angle of incidence, angle of reflection, right, on a perfectly flat surface, they would all do this. Okay?
Throw back my legs and pollute
it's
my
not rash.
with delight.
Thank you so much. So you've now got light that hits the ground in front of him. The ground is going to be reflective. Grass, concrete, stone, all of it has reflective properties. It's just a variance on how much. It won't be as bright as obviously the direct light, but there'll be a minimal amount of light reflection coming off of the ground. Desert, you walk out and it's just as bright looking at the ground sometimes when you're staring at the beach. The surface of water, all those things become light sources, and so you got to remember that. And so the light comes up. So now we do have the possibility of light reflecting down low here, right? Like on this section of his belly, which is why I didn't shade very dramatically here. Like on the inside of the knee and thigh here from the ground. But it would be less bright than like the shoulder and the top of the head, okay? But it would be brighter than the dark side of his thigh, even though it's lower on the model, right? Because we've got this idea that we go, let's say, brighter, right, and dim. We don't want to necessarily say dark, but we go bright to dim on models, top to bottom, usually. That's the rule of 80-20, right? Generally, we have our light source up high. There's very dramatic things that you've seen me do that you can make happen where your light source is down below, and then you just flip these. You'd have bright down here and dim up here, and those can be really cool. But what I want to try to show you is that light comes from everywhere. When you're in an ambient kind of situation like outdoors, diffuse light from the sun coming through the atmosphere, clouds, all of that makes it like it really is radiating from all around you. Yes, there's a bright source from the side where you have light, but much like my face in the camera right now, my main light source is here, but I have a secondary light source over to my left, so you're seeing that yellowy glow. You can also see that the temperature of the lamp is different, right? So the lamp that is lighting the left side of my face here, right for you guys, is yellow, whereas this is on this side is more of a white light, right? So you get this variance in color and temperature because of that too. So, you've got all this happening. So when you take into account the metals, that's why when I have this going on this side, I'm still going to put some bright reflection on this piece of plate here, even though it's directly 180 degrees out from our light source. And you might think, oh, it'll just be dark. No, because there's light coming down here and reflecting off of the stone. There's going to be light reflecting off of this sword that hits and reflects back. So there's light and areas coming from everywhere. I'll just make sure that it doesn't get as bright as this part of this shoulder over here, right? Because this part of this shoulder over here is kind of directly in the path of the light, as is this top piece here. This one doesn't really get any direct lighting, so it'll be dimmer, but still go through the process of reflection because of all of this. And when you say, like, this is a flat surface, which never happens, unless you're like on an ice rink, right? Or standing in a parking lot. The reality is you've got rocks and, trees and dead people and, whatever else on the ground. So now you've got, light rays bouncing off like this and bouncing like this and, bouncing like this. And so you can see very quickly how the undulations in the terrain create this glow that basically is a uniform light source coming up from the ground, is the way I like to think about it when you're doing artwork. Unless you're providing like a very dramatic light source where you want to be very specific with your reflections. Generally, you can think of the ground as being a secondary light source. It's just going to be very dim. So pick a value and call it 10 of your main light hitting the top of the head and the body and all these other angles, and then think of this value down here as being like a 3 or a 4 as far as brightness. Not even half as bright as this, more like a third as bright. But it will do things like provide you with a little bit of highlight on the bottom of the shield. Maybe if you were doing a metal band around the circumference of the shield, then the light reflecting off the ground would give you a bright spot on the bottom. So you wouldn't just paint it all in shadow. See what I'm saying? So it gives you, especially as you move towards reflective surfaces like non-metal, glass, shiny plastic, shiny fabrics, anything that has a reflective value to it, you have to take into account that ground light source, right? Or that reflected light source that is coming from walls, the ground, whatever you've got in the environment around this model that would cause those reflective points to occur even on the dim or bottom part of our miniature. Okay. Yeah, and like Silvernail says, I mean, the fact that you can see an object means that there's light reflecting off of it. So, but we don't think in terms of that. A lot of times we think like, okay, pick a light source, and all my painting and highlights come from that direction, and that can give you a very cool, intense kind of a feeling to the model. And the more you keep your highlights coming from a single direction, the more intense that story becomes. The more you push your shadows counter like 180 degrees off from your light source, the more it makes it feel like it's a spotlight, very intense, dramatic scene that you're setting. So it has some emotional value to it, and it can make sense if you're telling a story, putting a model in a specific diorama, things like that. Then you can play with those things and get really, really cool features going on with your model. But in general, if you're painting, like, say, an army, you're painting a bunch of dudes, you don't necessarily want that direct lighting on them all the time, because when you set a squad of guys on the table, if they're not all facing the same direction, but all the lighting's coming from the same, then all of a sudden it starts looking wonky. So you generally want to pick, like, kind of generalized light sources like you see me painting with most of the time, unless you have a specific story you're trying to tell on the model. Like when we did the alien diorama, right? We painted these guys with a overhead ambient light source when we painted them, and then we're coming back in and adding the direct light source, the very dramatic light source from the emergency lights that we're painting, right? So we've got a white blue light in the room, not blue, just like a white light in the room that's from the overhead, whatever lighting in the spaceship or whatever, right? And that's how we painted the models. So they don't have any real dramatic lighting on them until we put them in the situation where they've got the red, right? And now that red gives you a very dramatic, because it only comes from one direction. It's very focused, right? And it doesn't saturate everything. And so now that tells a very dramatic story, as opposed to if we just, sunk the red everywhere. So that's kind of a good way to show both of the styles of lighting that I'm talking about. We have a general all-over lighting that lights the models, and then a very specific yet dimmer lighting in our red emergency lighting that's giving you color and drama to these models coming off of the emergency lights, right? So it lets you play with, various lights in the same scene to create more of a story. Y2Ace, been painting for 3 years now, and this is the best, easiest to understand demonstration on Talk on Light you've ever heard. Fantastic. Fantastic. See, I'm glad it helps. It's what we're here for. And Wednesdays are great. I mean, we do this every day, but Wednesdays are great because I take less time focusing on necessarily the model that I'm painting and more on your questions. So always feel free. If there, and sometimes you won't even think you have questions until you hear us start talking about it in chat, but always feel free to ask in chat if you've got something.